All right, so you are in a treat for today's episode here on Industrial Sage. I've got a very special guest. Her name is Joanne Sanders from EY's Communications, and she's going to be joining us today and talking about the importance of messaging particularly if you've got like international companies and you're expanding, looking to go in outside the United States, or if you're a foreign company and you're coming here. Joanne has just a ton of experience and knowledge. She's also on the board of directors for the World Trade Center of Atlanta. She also serves as, I'm going to look at this because there's so many things, serves as the International Manufacturing Liaison for the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance, and this year as well. She's very, very popular. She won the Georgia Latina Excellence Award for Business and Technology. And not only that, the city of Atlanta actually gave her an award as well. So she's been incredibly busy. Stick around for this episode of Industrial Sage. You're not going to want to miss it. It's going to be awesome. And I'm Danny Gonzalez, and this is Industrial Sage. So Joanne, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Industrial Sage. So before we really get going, and we had an intro, you've got a lot of great background there, but if you could just introduce our audience to who EY's is a little bit deeper, EY's Communications and yourself, and a little bit more of your background, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. So really, the way that I explain EY's is really kind of explaining how EY's began. So really, I'm a former sales executive that was quite honestly frustrated with marketing.
Wait, frustrated with marketing?
That's right. So frustrated with marketing.
Happens.
That's right. So frustrated with marketing, meaning that they were producing a lot of materials that were great, they were beautiful, but they weren't in alignment to the buying process. They didn't speak to my buyer. They actually weren't helping me close the deal. So a lot of times what I would do is I would receive these marketing pieces that weren't really helping me. So I would basically end up redoing them. And so finally, after a while, I thought, you know what? Why don't I go ahead and start my own group here, my own agency? And so EY's came about. And that was about 9 years ago. And because of that sales background, really EY's has turned into a target marketing agency. And so EY's really focuses on helping companies launch products, launch into new industries, launch into new regions. A lot of companies have their own marketing person, but when it comes to expanding and really making a big leap into a new market and so forth, and really it's a business decision much more than even a marketing decision, that's usually when they bring me in. And because of that, we've actually done a lot of work on the international front. And so we've worked with a lot of international manufacturers, in fact, that are trying to come into the US or to the European market. And we've also worked with domestic manufacturers that are trying to expand overseas. So that's a little bit about EY.
Excellent. No, I love it. I love the whole, there's so much friction a lot of times between sales and marketing, and so I think you hit the nail on the head there. So, but segueing into really our topic and everything that we're going to be going on as far as the international companies and that specialty. Talk to me a little bit about that. What are some of those challenges? Are there challenges around that?
Definitely. I mean, the thing about it is that there's a lot of different nuances when it comes to dealing with international marketing. So general marketing is, really kind of packaging a company, understanding your brand, getting your messaging, your value proposition, really articulating that, and then turning that into pieces that support that, and then campaigns that reinforce it to your target audience. But when you're dealing with international, then you really have to take a look at all of those things, because you do all of those things, but you have to look at it from a universal perspective. Right. You have to make sure that a message is universal, and that that message yet can apply to different regions, and that you can kind of massage that particular message, that brand, to be applicable and to almost seem localized, yet it's still communicating at a broader audience. Right. There's cultural nuances that you have to take into account. And so there's just a whole other dimension of things that you really have to think about when you're doing international marketing. There's really no room for assumptions. There's just no room for that. You really have to be careful when you're doing that.
And that makes a lot of sense. And I know there's a tremendous amount of companies that are they're foreign, that are making their entrance into the U.S. markets. I mean, I know here in Atlanta and Alpharetta, and there's a ton of all kinds of European companies and Asian companies that are here. Yeah. So, what are some of those challenges that they might be facing coming in as a foreign company, an international company, trying to break into a new industry in the U.S. market in particular? What are some of those challenges from that marketing, that messaging standpoint they might be looking at?
Well, and I think so. So if you split them up both ways, so there's the foreign companies that have moved into the U.S. market. They're trying to further anchor into the U.S. market, and a lot of times those companies, they were successful overseas, and so they're trying to kind of come into this market, and they're applying basically the same rules of engagement.
Rubber stamp it.
That's right,
yeah.
Exactly, and they're applying the same kind of rules of engagement into this market, and you can't do that. And so they're having trouble, recruiting workforce and or recruiting people to come to their company. They're having trouble really sticking the landing with it when it comes to this particular market. So a lot of times it's a lot of cultural, just a lot of understanding kind of the different business models and the different business dynamics when you're a foreign company. But when you're a domestic company that's trying to expand overseas, it's, you almost have to apply that in the other direction.
Exactly,
You can't assume that the business culture and your business practices and whatever has led you to be successful in one particular market will apply to the other. And so you've got to make sure that you kind of open your mind, you check everything, and you don't run on assumptions. That's one of the biggest things that people do, is that they assume a gazillion things. And they assume that, well, and I'll give you some examples.
Perfect.
So a lot of companies, of course, they're working on digital marketing campaigns. And they assume that, here in the US, you're doing Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, and you've got a model here. And so they assume that, well, I'll just replicate that model and I'll do it in Spanish, or I'll do it in another language.
Right.
Well, the reality is that there are rules in different cultures. So for example, if you're trying to do a digital marketing campaign in China and Asia, there's other social media platforms in that market that are different from that nobody has heard about here in the US. When you're translating different campaigns and different things, you have to make sure that those messages resonate in different languages, otherwise you could really step in it. And for example, a lot of times they include email marketing as part of those digital campaigns. And if you're trying to do email marketing in Europe has ridiculously strict email privacy laws. And if you start doing email marketing, something as innocent as sending an email or an advertisement through that medium, and you violate some of those rules, you can get heavily fined, and in some cases you could even end up in jail.
Really?
And so,
in jail?
Right. And so you've got to really be careful. You can't assume that a particular marketing initiative that worked in one country or in one region is going to work for another.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of different things, just outside of just from the culture. It's just also understanding what are the rules. What are the rules of the playground over here?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and here's another example. For example, a lot of times people assume that the purchase path of a product is the same in one region versus another. I was raised overseas. I was raised in the Caribbean, and here, like if you buy something, if you're manufacturing, I don't know, tomato sauce or something like that, and if you buy it here at the grocery store, you also buy it at the grocery store in Latin America, but there's also small little convenience stores, and then there's whole communities around those kind of convenience stores, and they're at every single corner. But actually, if you just focus on the grocery store, you actually miss out on a huge part of the purchase path of most people that are buying that particular product. And so a lot of times people don't think about, they think about how do I create awareness and how do I do that, but they don't think about the supply chain and the purchase path and where the buyer is and how they are buying. And that's really different in the different countries based on infrastructure and for a variety of reasons.
Well, that's really interesting. So note to self, no spamming in Europe.
That's right. No spamming in Europe.
That might work here, maybe.
Yes, that's right.
But over there, you said you might get in. You might
get into trouble. You can get into big trouble. Yes.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if we will see that maybe down the road over here. As I know Europe went through a lot of privacy issues and things, and I'm sure that'll make its way over here to the United States at some point.
Yeah, well, and I was just going to add, so I recently spoke at the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance. They had their annual conference, about 3 weeks ago now, and that was one of the things that caught everybody's attention. They thought, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that, like I said, something as innocent as that could get you into a heap of trouble.
Yeah.
So you really need to work with experts that really understand what they're doing and really can at least set that foundation from an international marketing perspective and help others kind of understand, how, what kind of systems that you need to put in place in order to make sure you're successful.
Absolutely, that's some really great information there. Didn't know that. So it kind of goes back a little bit to and we talk about it here all the time, is really strategy, personas. Looking at the persona development, it's like that's another level. So you could have your personas kind of leveled out here for the U.S., but then it's like, well, that is not necessarily going to translate to somebody overseas, or maybe it does, but how you reach them is going to be completely different. So.
Absolutely. If you're trying to get into the healthcare market in Brazil, it's going to be very different than you trying to penetrate the healthcare market in Asia or in Europe. And it's all about, there's different buyers involved, right? And you have to kind of develop, understand who that persona is and that buyer profile. There's different buyers, there's different people that are part of that purchase process and that decision-making path. So it really is. You cannot assume that whatever has worked in one market is going to work in the other.
Right.
You can't assume that, you just can't assume anything. That's probably one of the biggest things, is that when you're dealing with international marketing, you almost need to go back and go back again and go back again and make sure that you cross your T's and dot your I's and there's no assuming anything.
That sounds like just a whole lot of fun.
Yes, yes. It's a lot of detail-oriented work, yes.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
So knowing, keep bearing this in mind, what are some high-level things to kind of keep in the back of your mind to, say, expanding into a global market, or even those companies that are here? Yeah.
Well, I think two things. I think messaging is really important, and it's important to make sure that you have a universal message and one that is simple. And a simple message doesn't mean generic, it doesn't mean boring. It means that you're just keeping it simple, that you're using words that everybody understands in order for you to be able to, at a macro level, be able to communicate with everybody. For example, FedEx, the world on time. Simple statement, everybody understands that, and then they can then mature that and say, well, the world on time, or Brazil on time, and they can take that and massage it for the specific markets that they're dealing with, but at the end of the day, it's something that encompasses everything. The other thing I would say is that when you are communicating, make sure that you're using the power of communicating through words and communicating through design. Visuals can really help kind of cut through a lot of issues, especially when you're dealing with international markets. And it's important to make sure that you're cognizant of how all those two are working together. I was reading an article about Louisiana, and Louisiana, nothing is more mouth-watering in Louisiana than like a picture of a crawfish with the word Cajun on it. Okay, but the reality, that's right. Well, but the reality is that not everybody understands or has seen a crawfish, right? And not everybody understands the word Cajun. So what so if Louisiana is trying to target and market to other people that have never visited, then what they need to do is they need to adjust that picture. You need to be able to communicate. They need to kind of, instead of a close-up, because that could look like a scary animal, right? You have to kind of draw back, put it on a plate, instead of just saying Cajun, which everybody there understands, you have to talk about, unique spices that come from this region that will, make unique seafood taste mouth-watering good. And when you explain it like that, it's simple terminology, but then it speaks to everybody, and it actually allows people to grasp at what you're trying to communicate to them. And it's just really important that, again, you have simple message that everybody understands, and then you marry communicating through words and design. That's usually the ticket to being successful.
Interesting. So makes sense. I imagine, though, that not everybody takes this to heart and actually implements this in the way that they probably should or could. Yeah. Any notable blunders that come to mind of any? A little bit, a few.
A few, yeah. I've got a couple. So there was this is one that I shared at the summit with the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance. There was a golf ball manufacturer who was doing very well in Japan, and they were selling large packages of golf balls in them. They were doing great, so they thought, how do we take things to the next level? Why don't we create a smaller package that people could pick up, at the cashier, at the convenience store, wherever else? And so they created a sleeve of 4 golf balls in it. Well, the problem is that the number 4 in Japan, the sound of the number 4 means death. So nothing in Japan is in 4s, right? They're in 3s and 5s and other, but they're not in 4s. And that's a cultural element that the marketing department didn't realize. So think about it. They produced all of these packages. There was packaging that had to be reassessed. They had to do promotional materials around this. They had to do all of this stuff just to then lose money, because then all their sales started going down. They're like, well, what happened? Wait a minute, this is a cheaper product. This was going so well. This is actually a cheaper product. Why are we losing money on it? Well, because they forgot that cultural detail, and see how one little simple thing made a huge difference. There's also another one that comes to mind. There's a very popular beer company, and I probably shouldn't say the name, really a popular beer company. They had a very popular promotion here in the US called, Let It Loose with this company, okay? Just let it loose. And so really popular campaign here. They said, you know what, perfect. We're gonna roll this out into Latin America. And so they did almost a verbatim translation. And and so you can imagine a verbatim translation actually meant you've got the runs instead of kind of kicking back and relaxing. And so it was incredibly embarrassing, and they were horrified. They had spent millions of dollars on advertisement just to then have to pull it all back. People were kind of laughing at the brand, and so they ended up having to pull back. So, those are some examples. And I use blunders. I think blunders are good examples of how we can learn and how we can pay attention. You need to make sure that your message translates well, not just your brand message, but your marketing campaign messages. Make sure that it translates well. You've got to validate it. I mean, if you take the extra step of validating, you're going to save, think about it. You save millions of dollars. These companies could have saved a whole lot of money. Talking to experts that are, again, kind of looking at specific things to make sure that you're not missing anything is just highly important. I do as much communication as possible around this in order to kind of build awareness, because a lot of companies here that are, again, trying to anchor further in need to be cognizant of those kind of things too. So if there's a German company here that's trying to, why aren't people just buying my things, right? Focusing on the things that resonated with the buyer in Germany. You've got to make sure that it actually translates well into the U.S. market, and the same the other way around. So
that makes a lot of sense, and it's really interesting there. I mean, to put it in perspective for the American viewer too, you're talking about. I really like the Louisiana example. Maybe the same thing, almost like trying to I don't know. We know in the United States, okay, Texas barbecue is really good, right? It's, trying to market that in maybe New England, not necessarily, or New England clam chowder down in.
That's right, exactly.
So it doesn't. But to your point, I mean, when you've got audiences who don't know that or have those nuances, that's very, very, very difficult. And I could imagine, I can even see that happening here domestically as well too. All the different regions and the areas, and so that's definitely it's very important to be able to look at and assess that.
Yeah, well, and I think particularly now that customer experience is really important and all of those kind of things, you really need to. It's really about the buyer, right, and really about the buyer processing information, experiencing everything, and you really just need to be very cognizant. And if the buyer has always been important, but now almost more than ever, and so you really need to pay attention to what you're doing. And honestly, the world is becoming global, so really it's good. This is good practice for any marketer to really start implementing international marketing. And if they're not familiar, then bring an expert, kind of set that foundation, and then kind of get going, and then let your marketing department go, because the world is becoming smaller and smaller.
Right.
So
I think you kind of addressed this a little bit, as far as like how to avoid some of those blunders. You mentioned, really surrounding ourselves with experts and people that really kind of. I mean, are there some key takeaways on that? Saying, look, if we want to go into the South American market, or companies that are foreign coming into the United States. Are there like 4 key steps or something that they might be able to take? Like, what would you recommend to those companies before they just go whole hog into something?
Well, so it's funny because within the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance, I've now created an international manufacturing group, and it's precisely for that reason, because most people don't know what to do. Like, I'm a domestic manufacturer. I want to go overseas. What country?
Let's expand.
Let's expand. But where? Where do I go? Do I go to Latin America? Do I go to Europe? Do I go here? Do I go there? Same thing for people trying to come into the U.S. The reality is that it always depends on your circumstance. But sometimes, like if you're trying to come into the U.S., foreign companies, a lot of times, they don't know about incentives that are available to them. They don't know about those kind of programs that are available through the economic development branches that are
Right.
here within the state. And so part of the group's purpose is to point people in the right direction depending on what they're trying to do. If they're domestic companies, they think, well, I can't afford to start exporting. There's grants for people that want to
Really?
actually
Interesting.
export. Yeah. And so people don't even realize that those kind of resources are available to them. When they're expanding overseas or they have an overseas workforce, there's things like taxes that change.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, okay, well, what do I do now? And their local CPA might not really know about international tax. But then there's groups here that focus on that. So part of the purpose of the group is to try to kind of work with the foreign companies as well as the domestic companies and kind of point everybody in the right direction. It always depends. I can't list kind of 4 things to think about.
Yeah.
But I think the most important thing is just look out for resources, surround yourself with people that are available. The good thing about Atlanta is that Atlanta does so much international marketing. There's over 70 trade centers here and trade, as far as like the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce and those kind of trade groups here. And the reason they've invested here is because Atlanta does so much business with those foreign companies.
Right, yeah.
Those organizations are great resources as well. Of course, each one of them is going to be a little bit partial. Come to Sweden, come to Brazil, right, and everything else. But they can answer a lot of questions as far as if I was to go to Brazil because I just visited and I really liked it, how would I go about doing that and so forth. So there's the resources like that. There's the state of Georgia. They've got a pretty robust international program there. And then there's over 200 international organizations, including the World Trade Center, which I'm a board member of, that is there to basically that do a lot of that matchmaking and to kind of bring together a lot of expertise together and allow people to network. And so there's a lot of resources available, and obviously within the group with the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance, that's part of my purpose is to try to kind of point people in the right direction.
So making the right connections there, surrounding yourself with experts and really jumping in and taking advantage of the resources that are available.
That's exactly right. And a lot of times it doesn't cost you anything to do that exploration. And so really, it's just about making the decision, okay, we want to explore this in 2018, 2019, whatever it is. So let me start surrounding myself with the right people that can point me in the right direction and kind of getting knowledgeable, because you want to know what you're buying before you buy. You want to know what you're doing before you embark on that, and that's the smart thing to do. So.
Well, this has been fantastic. It's been a lot of great information.
Thanks.
There's a lot of nuggets of wisdom and great sound bites said there before that I think is great. And it's really just a good sort of eye-opening conversation here. Just I think one of the big takeaways for me, anyways, that I thought was interesting is about how some of the digital marketing tactics that are working here.
Yeah.
In the States, you can't rubber stamp that and say, oh, hey, that's going to work in Europe. I don't want to land in jail or
that's
whatever
right,
that is.
That's right.
Or or other. Hey, you need to be aware of other social networking networks.
That's right.
In other countries that we had no idea about. So really, just really at the end of the day, it goes back to that strategy and that really getting an understanding of what's working in that market and those people. So this has been fantastic. So.
Thanks.
If anybody has any questions, they'd like to ask any questions after this, we'll put all your information in the show notes, but what was the best way of reaching you?
You can find my contact information on eyscommunications.com, or you can call me directly at 404-644-2779.
Perfect.
Right.
Thanks so much
for
joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks again for watching or listening if you're on iTunes. This the episode that we had here with IndustrialSage, with Joanne Sanders, with EY's Communications. Really great. A lot of great information here, all the way from companies that if you are expanding into the United States, or companies that are in the U.S. and they're looking to go out and expand their global reach. Some really strong considerations from a communications and a messaging standpoint that, hey, look, the stuff that we're doing here, whether you're U.S.-based or you're foreign-based, may not work in that company or the country that you're looking to expand. So really, really surround yourself with experts who really understand how to take your product and your service and your messaging and really apply that to where you're trying to expand and go. And really jump into the resources. A lot of great resources around here. If you happen to be from Georgia, there's the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance. Joanne started the international sector, that group in there. I'll make sure that information is in the show notes there. But there's a lot of resources out there to be able to help you be more successful. So again, key takeaway, really invest, research, look at where you're going to go, see what's going to apply and what isn't, and Thanks again for watching. Like always, if you have any questions, please reach out to us, industrialsage.com/questions. And be sure to like, subscribe, share, review, all that good stuff. We'd love to hear back from you. And we will talk to you next week. Thanks.